In that time were made those things that afterwards were most renowned of all the works of the elves. For Fëanor, being come to his full might, was filled with a new thought, or it may be that some shadow of foreknowledge came to him of the doom that drew near, and he pondered how the light of the trees, the glory of the blessed realm, might be preserved, imperishable. Then he began a long and secret labor, and he summoned all his lore and his power and his subtle skill, and at the end of all he made the Silmarils. As 3 great jewels they were in form, but not until the end, when Fëanor shall return, who perished ere the sun was made, and sits now in the halls of waiting, and comes no more among his kin, not until the sun passes and the moon falls, shall it be known of what substance they were made. Like the crystal of diamonds it appeared, and yet was more strong than adamant, so that no violence could mar it or break it within the kingdom of Arda. Yet that crystal was to the Silmarils but as is the body to the children of Ilúvatar, the house of its inner fire, that is within it, and yet in all parts of it, and is its life. And the inner fire of the Silmarils Fëanor made of the blended light of the trees of Valinor, which lives in them yet, though the trees have long withered and shine no more. Therefore even in the darkness of the deepest treasury, the Silmarils of their own radiance shone like the stars of Varda. And yet, as were they indeed living things, they rejoiced in light, and received it, and gave it back in hues more marvelous than before. All who dwelt in Aman were filled with wonder and delight at the work of Fëanor, and Varda hallowed the Silmarils, so that thereafter no mortal flesh, nor hands unclean, nor anything of evil will might touch them, but it was scorched and withered. And Mandos foretold that the fates of Arda, earth, sea, and air, lay locked within them. The heart of Fëanor was fast bound to these things that he himself had made. Welcome, I'm Professor Rachel Fulton Brown, and this is The Forge of Tolkien. What were the Silmarils? So in making notes for today's episode, I was trying to think. I've read that passage to you several times now, and each time I've kind of intensified it. And I talked about the trees, and I think I've talked about gemstones, and I remember talking a little bit about pearl and the green and the green. Well, let's think more particularly about what the Silmarils were and how Fëanor made them. Right? Well, they're not the first gemstones that the Noldor make. And this is not the version that I just read of you is not the only time that Tolkien tried to explain how they were in fact made. So some of what I want to do in this episode is simply give some more of the backstory on the Silmarils, but also think about what are gemstones, right? And what is Tolkien doing with them. Okay, so in the last episode, I talked about the splintering of the elves, right? How the elves start at the Lake of Awakening under the stars, and the Valar invite them to come to Valinor, and as I described to you, I hope not too confusingly, because it's splintering, right? It's this rainbow spectrum of elvish light that is, and some of them are going to end up in Valinor, and when they get there, the Valar give them a special place to live. That the elves themselves, that as the tale tells, miss the light of the stars, and when they are in Valinor proper, where the trees are shining, they can't see the stars, and so the Valar give them a city, as it were, outside of the shiny spot, with walls that enable some of the starlight to get through. And this is where they build their city of Tuna. On the crown of Tuna, the city of the elves was built, the white walls and terraces of Tirion, and they have various towers there and so forth. So the elves are not living, the Eldar, so the Vanyar and the Noldor in particular, the Teleri are living a little different space in the Blessed Realm. They're not living, as it were, right next to the Valar, but at a little distance. And they're going to be engaged in their own making and building in this new situation. Now, Manwë and Varda, the tale tells, loved most the Vanyar, the fair elves. And remember, those are the ones that we talked about last time. They're specifically light-haired, right? They're the golden-haired elves, right? But the Noldor, and Feanor is of the Noldor, right? His father is Finwë, and Feanor, as a Noldor, is one of the makers, right? The Noldor were beloved of Aula, the same one who made the dwarves, right? We're gonna have all these I'm gonna have all these characters down. You guys probably all had them down ages ago, right? Okay, no, the Noldor were beloved of Aula, the maker, and he and his people came often among them. Great became their knowledge and skill, yet ever greater, but even greater was their thirst for more knowledge, and in many things they soon surpassed their teachers, which is a pretty amazing claim, right? The Valar are, as we've talked about, the assisting angels at creation, and here the suggestion is that the elves in their own making become incredibly skilled. They were changeful in speech, for they had great love of words, and sought ever to find names more fit for all things that they knew or imagined, which again is intensifying what I talked about last time with the splintering of the elves. It's like I get so many. I hope you guys are enjoying this, because I just get so many ideas in my head while I'm talking, and I don't always get them all out. And then you may be able to sense it. It's like she had something else that she wanted to say. Well, what I wanted to say in the last one was, it's interesting how the splintering of the elves is and this birth of language, right? This birth of all these different elvish languages, so that Tolkien is trying to show through the splintering of the light by way of the characters of the elves, this magnificent flourishing of human languages. So you might make it as a tree, or you could say it's like the Tower of Babel. It's interesting that, they have a tower here, the Tower of Ingwa, whose silver lamp shone far out into the mists of the sea. So it's a big lighthouse, right? And the lighthouse shines from the top of the tower of the city of the elves in Valinor, in the Blessed Realm. And they're learning to name things, right? So the light and the names are going to be conjoined in this mystery. But then there's something else, right? So they're becoming very skilled, they're living in the light, they're naming new things, and their speech is changing. And it came to pass that the masons of the house of Finwë, quarrying in the hills after stone, they delighted in the building of high towers. Right, so this is very interesting, and I hadn't thought of this before I started talking to you, so strap in. That they are quarrying for stone to build towers, which matters, right? They're building up in their hubris, potentially. I mean, they become great. They're love of skill and love of naming, and they're building towers, and in digging for the stone for the towers, first discovered the earth gems, right? So the gemstones come out of the earth that they discover, and brought them forth in countless myriads, and they devised tools for the cutting and shaping of gems, and carved them in many forms. They hoarded them not, but gave them freely, and by their labor enriched all Valinor, which is in the good situation, right? That they're digging all the gemstones, and they find these beautiful rocks in the ground when they're digging for building stones, and they give them out as gifts, including to their kinsmen who are living down on the seashore, right? And this is the Teleri, that these latecomers, right? And not all of the Teleri who left the Lake of Awakening show up in Valinor, right? Some of them stay in what we'll learn is Beleriand and become the family of Luthien, right? But some of the Teleri show up, and they're given, because they still so love they're drawn to the light, but they still have this desire to stay with the sea. So Elmo gives them the craft of shipbuilding, and they make great swan ships. This is going to become significant over the course of the long story, right? But right now, the Teleri are living on the seashore, and they make ships that are strong-winged swans, sorry, I'm confusing myself. They build the ships, they're swan ships, and the ships are drawn by swans, Then the swans drew up the white. I'm confusing it because I've seen drawings that Tolkien made of the ships as swans, right? Okay. So the swans drew the white ships of the Teleri over the windless sea, and thus at last and latest they came to Aman and the shores of Eldamar. Now the Teleri are going to be living on the shore, and the Noldor give them gifts, including gemstones, right? So there they dwelt, and if they wished, they could see the light of the trees, and could tread the golden streets of Valmar and the crystal stairs of Tirion upon Tuna, the green hill. But most of all, they sailed in their swift ships on the waters of the Bay of Elvenhome, or walked in the waves upon the shore, with their hair gleaming in the light beyond the hill. Many jewels the Noldor gave them, opals and diamonds and pale crystals, which they strewed upon the shores and scattered in the pools. Marvelous were the beaches of Elinde in those days. Okay, so they get earth gems from the Noldor, who've dug them out of the ground, and they scatter them as it were on the beaches. But they also get their own gems, right? And many pearls they won for themselves from the sea, and their halls were of pearl, and of pearl were the mansions of Olwe at Alcalonde, the haven of the swans, lit with many lamps. Look at the conjunction of images that were coming. It's the towers and the gemstones, the light and the languages. You have the sea and the swans and the pearls. And the haven of the swans is lit with many lamps, right? So reminding you that we're always talking about light, right? This is the great mystery of the splintering of the light, and the gemstones have to come into that as part of the I'm going to say architecture, because it's more alive than that, right? Although we're talking about building towers, right? So there's an architectural image there, but there's a life to this imagery that we need to understand. So the haven of the swans, for that was their city and the haven of their ships, and these were made in the likeness of swans. That's why I'm getting myself confused. So the ships are towed by swans and made in the likeness of swans, with beaks of gold and eyes of golden jet. The gate of that harbor was an arch of living rock sea carved, and it lay upon the confines of Eldamar, north of the Calakiria, where the light of the stars was bright and clear. Okay, so it's in this like gem-studded context that Feanor makes the Silmarils, and so their mystery is bound up in that they are not the only gemstones in the Blessed Realm, but the Silmarils are different, right? They're these special ones that Feanor makes. But what are they, right? And it's so interesting that we have the like the crystal of diamonds, but as Tolkien tells it in the version of the Silmarillion that Christopher published as the canon, right? The canon. We don't know what substance they're made of. Why not? How does one make a gemstone, right? Well, what's interesting is, and you could think, okay, well, fine. We've been given it's like their earth stones, their sea stones, and so forth. Why leave it so indefinite? They're basically diamonds. I think the way Tolkien eventually imagines them is they're diamond-like, right? They're faceted and they scatter light, so they seem to be most like diamonds. But he seems to not want them to be simply diamonds, which means he wants them to be something other than rocks, I think, right? Okay, well, happily, because we have all of the previous versions that Tolkien wrote, we have particularly some clues. How shall we read these clues, right? And this is, I want to go back to what I showed you from Verlyn Flieger's Splintered Light, what she says that Tolkien is doing with all of this imagery, right? And remember this claim that she makes in describing just the light imagery generally, right? And that her theme in Splintered Light on the logos and language in Tolkien's world is to claim that Tolkien is doing something very, very specific with metaphor and the interaction between the literal and the metaphorical, and that everything that he's doing requires an understanding of this relationship between the literal and metaphorical. Let me remind you what she says he did. So Tolkien's treatment of light in the Silmarillion derives its primary image from his Catholicism, its linguistic method from Barfield's theory. And Barfield's theory is that primary unity of language, right? The concepts that what we break down now into physical and spiritual and metaphorical, breath, wind, spirit, right? So our living breath and wind and spirit in Barfield's theory are all the same word, spiritus, and that what Tolkien is doing through his stories is trying to show that relationship coming into history, right? The mythology breaking into history, the language breaking out of the mythology. His approach is to first restore to words their primal unity of concept, and then to set up a progressive fragmentation of both word and percept as these express a changing relationship to the fictive world and a diminishing reflection of its light. His technique is to confer literality on what would in the primary world be called metaphor, and then to illustrate the process by which the literal becomes metaphoric. Right? So we're going to be watching the way in which he is purposefully drawing on literal elements in the world, right? Stones and water and air, and using those literal elements, his characters who are real characters, right? And the materials that they interact with in the world, all of these actual story, the plot, the setting, the weather, the clothing, all of those things that you could say, they're not just part of the physical world, but it's the part of the story world, the literal. And he is making those literal things out of what we would in the primary world call metaphor, giving life to the metaphor, as it were, and then show the process by which the literal becomes metaphor. So it's this, literal, metaphor, literal, and that interaction, that reflexivity is what drives his stories. And what I'm trying to help you appreciate is at least why I love them so much, because it's not allegory, right? It's not, here's this personification that is going to have a variety of attributes. I was talking in my campus class yesterday, we were talking about grammar and her attributes. She has a scalpel for, cutting, pruning words, and medicine for, soothing the throat and so forth. And she's represented in medieval sort of grammar treatises as this old woman with various characteristics and objects and clothing and so forth. And that all of those objects are meant to point you to what grammar is like. But there's not a literal, it's like a visual reality, but it's not a story reality in the way that Tolkien tries to give his characters, so that everything in the story works even if you don't know what the metaphor is, which the grammar stuff doesn't, right? It's like, why should she have that pruning fork in the medicine? And that's like confusing, right? Allegory leaves you with this sense of, I don't get it if you don't get it. Whereas what Tolkien is doing, this literal metaphorical relationship, you can completely enjoy the story on that literal level, right? The story works in every aspect if all you get is Silmarils are fancy gems that Fëanor made and people tried to steal them, which is basically what happens in every Gemstone story, right? And I do think, ultimately this is why I love gemstone theft. I love theft stories, right? And although this one's not quite the theft and Melkor steals them and everything, but it's driving it by the desire for these gemstones that makes a perfectly understandable story if that's all you know, right? But if you can start feeling the reality of fairy, the secondary world, the metaphor, active in that literal, there's not really a word for how cool that is. That you know, it's like when you know, those of us in an unauthorized world, right? We love coincidences and things coming together and patterns and stuff like that. It's feeling like that, right? When you suddenly feel that you're in the significance, inside the Silmaril, the story. Okay, well, that's what we're trying to figure out. And we have more clues potentially about the way Tolkien is thinking about these gemstones if we go back to our Book of Lost Tales. Now, we haven't talked about those in a while, and remember, Ariel is there in the Cottage of Lost Play, hearing stories about what the elves know of creation, and now we're coming to the part that is their own story, right? The coming of the elves, and the character speaking now is going to be she's going to say, Inwe was my grandsire's sire, which makes it my grandfather's father, great grandfather. So, and she's saying, and her the speaker here is a character called Meryl the Queen, who is able, and I think it's actually interesting that it's the Queen telling the story by this point rather than Rumel and she is now going to narrate that same version, that same episode that I read to you from the Silmarillion, but with some interesting details. Okay, so she starts with the swan ships, right? Now is to tell how the Solosimpsi, that's what will become the Teleri, fared often about the near seas in their swan ships, or drawn by the birds. I think it is confusing, like whether they're drawn by the birds. And I've also been, there's a great swan ship in John C. Wright's Green Knight Squire, right? So I'm also clearly overwriting there. Okay, still the Simpsy. Fared often about the near seas in their swan ships, or drawn by the birds, or paddling themselves with great oars that they had made to the likeness of the webs of swan or duck. Okay, that's why I was confused about the swan ships. They're both. And they dredged the seabeds and won wealth of the slim shells of those magic waters, an uncounted store of pearls of a most pure and starry luster. Pearls of pure and starry luster. And these were both their glory and delight, and the envy of the other Eldar, who longed for them to shine in the adornment of the city of Kor. Now this is interesting because we flipped it, right? In the canon version of the Silmarillion, the Noldor give the Teleri the gifted gems, and then we learn about the Teleri discovering the pearls. But in this story, the Noldoli, who are going to be the Noldor, but the Noldoli envy the Solosimpsi for their pearls, and now we learn what the Noldoli are able to do. But those of the Noldoli whom Allah had most deeply taught labored in secret unceasingly, intensifying that feeling of their skill and their desire for greater knowledge, right? And of Allah they had wealth of metals and of stones and of marbles. And of the Leave of the Valar much store too was granted to them of the radiance of Cululen and of Telimpe, held in hidden bowls. I'm interested in this earlier version. The secrecy is so intensified, and they're being given bowls of light and more stones to work with. Starlight they had of Varda, and strands of the bluest Ilwe Manwe gave them. So now they're working with bowls of light and starlight. Water of the most limpid pools in that creek of Kor, and crystal drops from all the sparkling founts in the court of Valmar. Dews did they gather in the woods of Orome, and flower petals of all hues and honeys in Yavanna's gardens, and they chased the beams of laurelin and silpion amongst the leaves. But when all this wealth of fair and radiant things was gathered, they got of the Solosimpsi many shells, white and pink and purest foam, and lastly some few pearls. It's all heading towards pearls, which is very interesting, right? It's in the Silmarils, as the canon version says, we don't know what substance there are. They're like diamonds. They have this life in them. They're body to this inner fire, but we don't know what substance they are, right? The earlier version suggests we do know what they are. They're made of water and light, and they're rather pearl-like, right? These pearls were their model. And the lore of Allah and the magic of the Valar were their tools. And all the most lovely things of the substance of the earth, the matters of their craft, and therefrom did the Noldali with great labor invent and fashion the first gems. This is very, very interesting, right? Because what we get in the later version is they dug them up, right? That they were digging for stones to build their tower, and they found the first earth gems. But the oldest version of the story from the Cottage of Lost Play is that they were making pearls, okay, and that they used, and the pearls were their model, and the lore of Allah and the magic of the Valar were their tools, and all the most lovely things of the substance of the earth, the matters of their craft, right? So I think when Tolkien later says this, he don't know what the substance of the Silmarils is. He's like, it's like substance, right? They're trying. He wants to make them of substance, which is to be like everything, right? Matter, the sort of Aristotelian substance, if you're thinking in terms of the Eucharist and transubstantiation. But he wants somehow for the Silmarils to capture the whole of creation in their creation, right? But earlier on, he had a very clear idea of what they were made about. Crystals did they make of the waters of the spring shot with the lights of Silpian. They're making rocks out of water, which is really interesting. It's like rock should be made out of rock, right? Or, molten rock. What are rocks made of? But they're making crystals of water. Amber and chrysoprase and topaz glowed beneath their hands, and garnets and rubies they wrought, making their glassy substance as Allah had taught them, but dyeing them with the juices of roses and red flowers, and to each they gave a heart of fire. This suggests to me very specific crafting that Tolkien had in mind when he's thinking about the Silmarils holding this fire, right? These sound like they're making windows, right? They're glassy substance tinted. They're stained glass, right? They're literally stained glass. Dyed them with the juices of roses and red flowers. So they're stained glass, so they look like they have hearts of fire. All the medievalists in the room should have figured out where I'm going already. Emeralds, some made of the water of the creek of Kor, and glints among the glassy glades of Valinor. And sapphires did they fashion in great profusion, tinging them with the airs of Manwë. So now they've confected them of all the elements, right? Earth, water, air, and fire. Right, so they're these. Sorry, I've got a hair in my eye. They're these elemental gems. So they have all of the materials of the world. Amethysts there were, and moonstones, beryls and onyx, agates of blended marbles, and many lesser stones. And their hearts were very glad, nor were they content with a few, but made them jewels in immeasurable number, till all the fair substances were well nigh exhausted, and the great piles of those gems might not be concealed, but blazed in the light like beds of brilliant flowers. Tolkien loves this mingling of gemstones and flowers, right? And I think I referred to this when talking about the trees, but the trees are like living gems. The two trees in Valinor, obviously they glow like silver and gold, right? But the trees as gem-like persist into Middle Earth, right? In the Lord of the Rings, that the trees in Lorien are silver and gold, basically. So Tolkien sees gemstones as flower-like and flowers as gem-like, like they're both equally alive. Then they took those pearls they had, and some of well nigh all their jewels, and made a new gem of milky pallor, shot with gleams like echoes of all other stones. And this they thought very fair, and they were opals. The Silmarils, they could be opals, right? They're diamonds. Are they opals or diamonds? But still some labored on, and of starlight and the purest water drops, of the dew of Silpian and the thinnest air, they made diamonds, and challenged any to make fairer. Okay, so everything seems to be made out of dew, drops of of water and light. Okay, and now we have the crafting of the Silmarils. Then arose Feanor of the Noldali, and fared to the Solacimsi, and begged a great pearl. All right, pearl-like. It's going to be pearl-like, and of course you should be remembering that Tolkien, one of Tolkien's favorite poems, because he did a translation of it, was in fact The Pearl, which I showed you glimpses of last time. But remember that this is one of the great 14th century poems in the repertoire that we have, right, of English literature. Sir Gawain and the Green Knight and The Pearl. And one of the features of the poem of The Pearl is a description of all of these gemstones that the dreamer sees in heavenly Jerusalem, right? So these are gemstones of paradise. They're gemstones of Valinor. They're gemstones of the Blessed Realm. And now we are going to have Feanor make one, or three, that's they're modeled on a great pearl, right? And he got moreover an urn full of the most luminous phosphor light, gathered of foam in dark places. And with these he came home, and he took all the other gems, and did gather their glint by the light of white lamps and silver candles. So now they're like candlelight and lamplight, and the glints off of all of the other gemstones. So when we're thinking about the Silmarils as containing all of the hues of creation, in the earliest version, Tolkien actually tries to describe Feanor doing that, right? I'm interested that he didn't leave it this elaborate, right? That this is clearly of the level of revelation in the description of the heavenly Jerusalem, right? When you have the 12 ranks of gemstones and in the bride of the heavenly Lamb, the Lamb, the city of God is the bride of the Lamb. Why Tolkien doesn't leave all of this in when he talks about the Silmarils later, but anyway, and he took, this is still Feanor, and he took the sheen of pearls and the faint half color of opals, and he bathed them in phosphorescence and the radiant dew of Silpian. Note dew again, right? And but a single tiny drop of the light of Laurelin did he let fall therein, and giving all those magic lights a body to dwell in of such perfect glass as he alone could make, nor even Aula compass. So great was the slender dexterity of the fingers of Feanor, he made a jewel, and it shone of its own radiance in the uttermost dark. And he set it therein, and sat a very long while and gazed at its beauty. Okay, so this is the actual crafting of the Silmaril, that there is a drop of light of Laurelin, and he's giving the lights a body to dwell in of such perfect glass as he alone could make, nor even Aula compass. So great was the slender dexterity of the fingers of Feanor, so he made a jewel, and it shone of its own radiance in the uttermost dark. Now this is, I mean, the Silmarils are going to become the star that Arendelle carries on his brow as he travels, above Middle Earth, and this starlight is going to be the same that Galadriel captures in the phial, that she then gives Frodo to carry underground and shine out against the darkness there. So this capturing of the light and embodying it is one of Tolkien's great mysteries. Then he made two more, incidentally, right? So he makes three, and had no more stuffs, and he fetched the other elves, to behold his handiwork, and they were utterly amazed. And those jewels he called Silmarilli, or as we say the name in the speech of the Noldali today, Silubrilthin. Silmarils is a better choice. Wherefore, though the Solacimsi held ever that none of the gems of the Noldali, not even that majestic shimmer of diamonds, overpassed their tender pearls, yet all have held, who ever saw them, that the Silmarils of Feanor were the most beautiful jewels that ever shone or glowed. Okay, and then we go on to describe how the city of the elves was lit by the wealth of all these gems and the sparkles and the sapphires and the clothing. They give gemstones to the Valar, and their clothing is in all of these lights and gemstones, and we end up with the Valinor giving back the light of the trees and 1,000 scintillations of splintered colors. Right, so everything here is a jeweled heaven. Well, even without including these details, Professor Flieger has a very interesting read on the great significance of the Silmarils. That if we're dealing with as it were, the relationship between the literal and metaphoric, and you're just like, okay, so literally, the Silmarils are, glass filled with light and dew and color, and they are, they shine with this radiance of themselves, right? They're not reflecting any glints off of light other places. It's like they have this light of themselves, right? So literally, they're that. What's the what else are they? What's the metaphor? What's the mystery encased in here? Well, Flieger's version is a little different from mine, but hers I think is extremely important for having here. So what she points out, and this is like the Silmarils, just as the story of the Silmarils, the Silmarillion, which basically the Lord of the Rings is also part of the story of the Silmarillion. You realize, it's the long arc which Tolkien saw all of his stories participating in. The Silmarils themselves as the 3 gems. She says focus much of the conflict and controversy that marked Tolkien's history. Lend themselves, the Silmarils, the focus of much, lend themselves to uses both dramatic and thematic. They function at once as literal artifacts, they're gemstones, they're actual gems, as potent metaphors for desire, which you think, like I said, I liked, jewel heists, right? And gems do that in most stories, the longing for that beauty or the lust. I mean, Melkor's lust for the beauty of the gems is going to be very great. So they're metaphors for the desire that the characters have. And at the highest level, as symbols charged with a variety of reference. Well, my. Okay. The Silmarils are real, metaphoric, and symbolic without ever being other than themselves. And this is absolutely critical for understanding Tolkien's method, but also for distinguishing it from, as again, allegory. What I say is that Tolkien's thinking like a medieval Christian throughout, which means that understanding the literal, metaphoric, and symbolic simultaneously is absolutely critical. But the thing that you always have to keep in mind is the literal is there, right? They aren't just metaphors. They aren't just symbols. They're always themselves. So as artifacts, she says, the Silmarils embody light as a physical reality, right? They shine of their own light. Tangible matter that can be touched, handled, and worked. So you can carry these gemstones around, and they have physical effects, like burning the hand of someone wicked who's holding it. So they're physical. We're going to get very... You have to understand this to understand Beren and Lúthien's story and, what they're doing when they're trying to get the gemstone off of Morgoth's crown. The gems themselves are physical light, right? You can carry them around, which makes them kind of flashlight-like. But the light is something that's also alive of itself, right? As jewels, this is Flieger, they are a metaphor for the desire of humankind for beauty and for the negative of this desire, possessiveness, covetousness, selfishness, and lust. Right, so they can be MacGuffin. Is MacGuffin the thing that you go after in a story, right? The object that all the characters want. That they are a kind of grail in that sense for the characters, right? The quest tends to revolve around finding this gem. Those of you who are following our project to write a story for the Bears. We're playing with gemstones. Coming this summer, we hope. That they work as a kind of grail image, which I don't think I'm going to be able to unpack in this episode. But that metaphor for desire. But, and this is where, it's interesting because Flieger, as I said, she's the most brilliant metaphor expositor of Tolkien's imagery that I've read. But there's still a point where she kind of pulls, or she doesn't go places that I would. But here we go. As symbols, however, that the Silmarils work most powerfully. They are the embodiments of Tolkien's theme of the power of light. It is through the Silmarils that he makes his clearest statement about the need for light, the impulse to seek it or turn toward it, and the perversion of that impulse into lust and hatred as desire turns in on itself and possession masters the possessor. I mean, even more than the ring. It's like the Silmarils are even more powerful than the ring in Tolkien's structuring of his symbol stories. The story becomes an exploration of the various effects of light and the terrible way in which this light, wholly good in itself, can yet lead into darkness, can even in the ultimate inversion of its quality become that darkness. And then there's some symbolic relationship between Feanor and the Silmarils, which we're going to talk about in a future episode when we talk about the fall of Feanor, right? But I'm trying to get you to really grasp onto this. Nothing happens without the Silmarils, and so we have to understand what Tolkien thought they were doing. Now, Flieger is saying it's light, right? And she's just focusing on the light. But we saw in the making of the gemstones, as originally imagined and told to Ariel by Merrill the Queen, that the making of these gemstones was considerably more complicated than simply like the crystal of diamonds, right? They're not just diamonds. There's something of the sea in them. There's something of dew in them. There's something of all of the other gemstones in them, and over and over and over again, they're alive, right? How can they be alive? Nobody really thinks of diamonds, however glittery they are, as alive. Pearls, on the other hand. Well then, what is a pearl? Everybody just told me it's all, grit gets in the oyster and it makes the pearl, makes the pearl around the grit to protect it from. No, that's not how pearls are made. And I'm, the beneficiary here of a wonderful exhibit that the Field Museum in Chicago had some decades ago now on pearls. And what you learned from the science, trust the science, is that no pearl is ever formed around a piece of grit, right? Because the oysters who make the pearls have zero desire to let grit get in their soft parts. They're actually incredibly good at filtering out the sand and things like that. But they do want to let some other stuff through to eat it, right? And pearls, fascinatingly enough, form around dead shrimp. Right? They're like little sarcophagi, right? So they are, if a piece of food gets caught in the oyster, as it were, and then it doesn't get fully digested or something like that, the pearl forms around the dead shrimp. Well, that's kind of icky, right? I mean, it's less fun thinking. It's not great thinking of the pearl forming around grit, and it's even less icky thinking it. Well, we know that it forms around dead animals. Does that mean that, like, the pearl in the poem, who's the little girl who the dreamer is seeing in heaven, and she's arrayed as one of the brides of the Lamb, and they're all dressed in pearls, is covered with dead bugs. Well, happily, in the Middle Ages, they didn't know either of those things, right? Neither, they did not, I mean, most people now don't realize that the pearls are little bugs, right, or dead bugs. So if you're dressed in pearls, you're dressed in dead bugs. Although I think for the cultured ones, they put something else in them to stimulate the oysters to make the pearls. But if you're in natural pearls, you're covered in bugs. But in the Middle Ages, that's completely not what people thought. And in fact, going back to antiquity, that's not what the scientific explanation for pearls was. It was rather different. We know from Pliny the Elder, the great ancient Roman naturalist writing the 1st century, he's famous for things like having seen the eruption of Pompeii, right? And has a great encyclopedia of creatures, and I mainly know it from the animals. I can't remember what else he describes in the Natural Historia, but in the Natural History, book 9, paragraphs 54 to 59, we have his account of where the pearls come from. I'm reading this summarized from the Medieval Bestiary, which I greatly recommend as a site. It's bestiary.ca. If you want to know what the stories around various animals are, it's a lovely compilation from a number of different not manuscript sources. They list manuscripts of where images are and so forth like that. But it's a compilation, which is basically the way medieval bestiaries themselves worked, which they're constantly compilations of compilations of compilations. Most of the beast lore, in fact, going back to antiquity, right? So if you are thinking that the Middle Ages was particularly gullible, they're just believing the ancients, right? For the most part. And the ancients, well, you consider how gullible they were, right? Herodotus talks about the gold digging ants and things like that. It's fascinating that these stories, these natural stories, are very, very durable. Two, they're Eurasian, right? We see them across the continent. And three, this three, I'm not sure there is a three, but this is the scientific, right? If you're talking about literal becoming metaphoric and then symbolic, this is the scientific understanding that medieval Christians, like the author of the Pearl poem, would have about where pearls come from. They come from heaven. So what Pliny said, and this is again paraphrasing the Bestiary site, pearls are the offspring of shells similar to oysters. At the breeding season, the shells gape open and become filled with the dew from the sky that makes them pregnant. They open out to the heavens. Remember all that stuff about Tolkien's talking in the Book of Lost Tales about the gemstones are made from dew, right? He is using the medieval understanding of where pearls come from, not the modern understanding. The medieval understanding is the shells open up to the heavens and are impregnated with the dew. It's not like protecting yourself from grit or dead animals. It's heavenly dewdrops. The quality of the pearl depends on the quality of the dew received and on the state of the sky. A clear sky produces a clear pearl, but a cloudy sky produces a pale pearl, right? What they understand in this pre-modern tradition is, those dewdrops, right? And go back to the Cottage of Lost Play, and they're talking about, Fëanor is modeling the Silmarils on pearls, and he gathers this light together, right? So the oyster's open. It's open to the light, to the starlight, potentially. He gathers all of this light and the dew of Silpian. They're Silmarils, right? Sil is moon in Elvish, and they're moon drops, right? And the moon drop falls into the oyster and makes the pearl. There's more details, right? This is the natural history version, where we're just understanding the literal understanding of pearls throughout the Middle Ages. If the shells are well fed, the pearls grow, but if there's lightning or thunder, the shells close up in fear and so shrink from lack of food. Pearls yellow with age and doze off with wrinkles, their youthful vigor lost. They're alive, right? And this is they're living gemstones, which I hope now is helping you understand why icons of Mary often are covered with these things. Hint. They're living gemstones, and they are impregnated by heaven. If the shell sees a hand, it shuts up to protect the pearl. If the hand enters the shell before it can shut, the hand is cut off by the sharp end. They're very protective of their pearls. Some say that clusters of shells have a leader, a large old shell that one knows how to take precautions. Pearl divers capture this leader, leaving the others easy to catch. This is still all Pliny the Elder, right? Pearls are found chiefly in the Indian Ocean, particularly around the island of Taprobane and Stoitis, Ceylon. But some are also found in the seas around Arabia and near Britain. Okay, so the scientific understanding of pearls is that they're made from heavenly dew, right? And what medieval Christians come up with is, for example, from Isidore of Seville in his etymologies, the pearl is born from the shellfish called oceloi. At night, these animals come near shore and conceive a pearl from the heavenly dew, celesti. So they're oceloi and they're celesti. Isidore loves these kind of naming, right? The naming. Remember the old nodoli are naming things. Medieval Christians love naming things and understanding things through their names, like Isidore is doing. So the heavenly celesti, oceloi, heaven shells, heavenly dew, hence their name, right? So pearls are the offspring of a marriage of heaven and earth, which made them delightful metaphors throughout the Middle Ages, of course, for the Virgin Mary's conception of the Son of God, right? And this imagery, it's certainly there in medieval understanding, constantly, because one, it's showing a relationship. I mean, it's one, you could describe her as a pearl, immaculately conceived, although that is this kind of conception, as much as anything, right? She's in the mind of God and conceived by her parents. But particularly at the Annunciation, when you're trying to understand the mystery of how God can enter into his creation always, right? This is, I've been telling you this, right, all along, that Tolkien is trying to understand the mystery of the incarnation and the pearl as an image of the heavenly impregnation of the star of the seashell, right, is an image of that incarnation, right, according to medieval metaphors, right. There are other ways in which the Virgin Mary, I keep pointing to this, I just have to keep pointing it to you over and over and over again, is also herself conceived of as this crystal that is impregnated with light, right? So we have, I think, what Tolkien's playing off of in both of the pearl imagery and the light imagery is ultimately always this mystery of the marriage of heaven and earth, right? And that what Fëanor is doing with this great pearl of the luminous phosphor light, a drop that becomes a pearl, and as I said, it's like in the whole process is like making stained glass. The best image of what this gem making means is the stained glass windows in a Gothic cathedral, right? And I've been talking about this a lot in a number of videos, and I really hope, I can't remember which ones I've said it in, did several ones. There's some other conversations I've had, the Kurgan, right? We had a great talk about that. So go back and look at the Kurgan's conversation with me on his channel about the imagery and the Marian imagery, right? But the jewel imagery here, what I want you to understand is that medieval Christians understand gems, particularly like pearls, as from heaven. And what's lovely about the pearl imagery, and therefore what's lovely about the fact that Tolkien throughout his description of the making of the Silmarils seems to be pointing to pearls rather than diamonds, right? He wants them to be alive and to understand that the living pearls in things like, you know, Pliny's you know, natural understanding of them grow, right? They're gems that grow. They're gems that are clearly made of living by a living thing, right? Now we think of them, sadly enough, as somewhat less heavenly, right? It's grit. There was in fact a intermediate theory between this lovely ancient medieval understanding of them being, you know, made from dew, right? That Linnaeus came up with, saying that instead of it being the dew heaven, it's Linnaeus, the great taxonomer of plants, right? He apparently gets this idea, also known in antiquity, but not that necessarily as current in the West, that an oyster makes pearls because it's been wounded, right? And this comes in for some bit of bemusement in his day, talking about how, you know, the pearls are basically, you know, pearls are from sickness, right? Okay, so we have modernity thinks of pearls as, I mean, colloquially either made from grit or properly made from dead bugs, or, you know, bemusingly on the part of Linnaeus, that they're just sick. Which means we basically, interestingly, don't understand the metaphors anymore, right? And that's why I'm saying Fleegard is focused on the light and the imagery, and I think she's mainly thinking of the Silmarils as diamonds. But if you think of them as pearls, and all of this light imagery, as well as the dewdrops, changes what the metaphor signifies. So if you're trying to understand, you know, the literal, metaphoric, and symbolic sense of the Silmarils, we need to have a rather different sense of the pearl. Well, interestingly, and I'm getting this about the pearl from one of my absolute favorite books. And if you're ready for it, are you ready for it? You ready for it? If you're ready for the way Tolkien thinks about scripture and figure and metaphor and symbol, you have to read this book, which is actually a little hard to get because it's like only in hardcover, and it was published by the University of Chicago, but it's actually kind of hard to get at. It's by one of my great intellectual teachers in the history of medieval exegesis, Friedrich Ohly, who was a very great German scholar of medieval commentaries, and I had to work a lot with his study of the Song of Songs for my own doctoral research, which I had to read all of in German. That was new to me. I was having to read German. Happily, these essays were translated and published as Sensus Spiritualis, Studies of Medieval Significs and the Philology of Culture. Well, I'm giving you a sort of pearl-like introduction here because he did a lovely essay on, it's a lecture that he gave, a lecture he gave in London in 1972 on dew and pearl, and specifically tying this understanding of the pearl to the ability, this understanding of the pearl to the way in which within the Western tradition the composition of poetry is understood, right? It's literally what you think about the pearl changes the way in which we think about artistic practice, right? Which is like mind-blowingly wonderful and amazing, because remember that what we're trying to understand here is what the Noldor or the Noldoli are doing as they make things, right? They are, you know, whether they're jealous or whether they're inspired, or whether they're digging and find rocks, or whether they're jealous of the Teleri Solosymsi, of their pearls. And remember how Flieger was also saying the Silmarils are this metaphor of desire. Well, they're the desire for making, which is huge, right? And therefore, fundamentally their desire for the crafting with words that storytelling involves, right? That Tolkien is ultimately involved in, right? This is all over and over and over about storytelling. And what Oli shows in this magnificent lecture, this Dew and Pearl lecture, is as the idea, the literal understanding of the pearl changed scientifically, so did the Western understanding of where poetry could come from change. For example, right? He gives an example from Goethe. I don't know Goethe particularly well. I've read Faust, and I can kind of pretend that I know what I'm talking about in Faust. But this is just a passage from Goethe's Westöstlicher Divan, and I don't know what that poem is. But what we're doing is showing the way in which Goethe still could see this old vision of what happened with the poem, with the pearl, and therefore with poetry from heaven. A drop fell fearfully into the wild ocean waves. The waves pounded it cruelly, but God rewarded the humble courage of belief and gave the droplet force and stamina. A silent oyster enclosed it, and now, to its eternal praise and reward, the pearl shines in our emperor's crown, looking lovely and shining gently. Oli cites this because he's saying this is the old vision of what a pearl was, right? The drop from heaven falls into the ocean. Remember, all of the imagery that Tolkien is playing with is with those swan ships and the sea and the pearls and the dew dropping from the trees of light. And here Goethe is showing you what it used to mean. God rewarded the humble courage of belief and gave the droplet force and stamina. It's like a seed, right? It's a living seed from heaven, the semen of heaven. Oh my God. Don't go in the rain anymore, right? Okay, so the drops come down into the ocean, and an oyster encloses it. There's magnificently sexual imagery here, but it's lovely and beautiful and alive. And now, to its eternal praise and reward, the pearl is now eternal, right? This gemstone becomes like the heavenly bodies of the saints, right? Glorified and beautiful and shining. The pearl shines in our emperor's crown, which is kind of a come down, right? Because it's in the emperor's regalia, right? Looking lovely and shining gently. Oli's point here is that's the way poets used to think about inspiration. And when they lost it, their whole sense of where their ideas came from changed, right? That he's trying to show a relationship between he's saying the history of poetic inspiration and its effects as the history of piety and style has yet to be written. We are scarcely conscious of the reasons for and the consequences of the loss of inspiration, the sinister nature of its drying up, indeed of its already having been forgotten. As a philologist, I try to approach the question of language by what it says about poetry. And then he goes into the moving of the pearl and saying, Oli is saying, as we change our ideas about natural history, we also change our ideas about where ideas come from, and this very specifically about where poems come from, and this is, I told you, Linnaeus had this idea that the pearl was, from the oyster being wounded, and here what Oli comments, with the end of the old belief, the world also lost its belief in poetic inspiration, insofar as, up to the time of Klopstock, it had been understood as divine inspiration. The pearl and the poem are, in the future, no longer a gift arising out of the union of heaven and earth, as they had been up to the time of Goethe's relief, but both are now merely the fruit of a suffering untouched by heaven. And he gives an example from Jean Paul in his Pelagynesian, in which we read, genius and sickness are such foster brothers that in our days men of talent are most frequently subjected to the most poisonous excrescences, simply because they imagine they can help their satirical acuity by their scorbutic acuity. Excuse me, I should have. Let me start over. Genius and sickness are such foster brothers that, in our days, this is the early 19th century, men of talent are most frequently subjected to the most poisonous excrescences, simply because they imagine that they can help their satirical acuity by their scorbutic acuity, and can help their nervous spirits with nervous fevers. Linnaeus did the same to pearl oysters, right? And Oli's point here is that the pearl metaphor is critical to understanding the way poetry has been thought and understood. He injected them with artificially fruitful illnesses, and the sicker they grow, the more pearls they conglobate and deliver. Oli comments, from now on, poets recognize their writing as a salutary mobilization of their inmost self with the purpose of staving off and overcoming the suffering perpetuated by a wound that threatens their very life, just like the process that affects the oyster, which in resisting the crisis it faces forms a pearl. Jean Paul, who was perhaps the first to interpret the formation of the pearl and the oyster as the union of genius and sickness, also spoke in his Sieben Kasroman when meditating about his verse of a humorous defense in circumstances where, quote, one totally covers one's inner self with philosophy like Diogenes' tub as protection against external wounds. Or to use a more beautiful metaphor, one insulates with the pearls of maxims the mother of pearl of our verse, like the pearl oyster that insulates the holes which worms bore into its mother of pearl. In the meantime, pearls are better than an undamaged mother of pearl is a thought that I really should describe in golden ink. Right? We end up with completely different understanding of making, Oli's suggesting when we change the science, which is very fascinating because the relationship between the literal and the metaphoric and the symbolic matters if you change your understanding of the literal, and that the literal understanding of the pearls in the past had been dewdrops from heaven encapsulated and made beautiful. Now, and I think about, it's like we're in a moment when everybody's like praising sickness, as it were. It's like we're going, thanks to what we're living through in 2021 with the whatever, we're changing our whole culture's understanding of creativity, of, you know, where light and inspiration and life comes from, maybe for good. I don't know yet, but Oli's main point as a problem is when the literal changes, the metaphoric and the symbolic are also shifting, and with the pearl we end up with, well, I had to write a poem about it, and I actually wrote this in 2009, a long time ago, and I'm surprised that I think it's still really, well, a pearl of great price. And this is, I think I had to write a poem about it because I couldn't explain it simply in prose, and so this poem is about my understanding of what we lost when we lost that understanding of the pearls. So, a pearl of great price. Prose explains itself. Poetry bemuses, manifest in its pentameters, yet veiled in its significance, like a pearl, hidden in an oyster, mystic, divine. I read an article this afternoon about the death of inspiration, how poets no longer look to heaven, but only within, their wounded souls the source of all their musings. Once upon a time, they prayed to God, opening their minds shell-like to the stars, as oysters awaiting the dew. Now, however, we no longer believe in dewdropped pearls, wetting heaven and earth. At their confection, pearls, we say, are like scabs, the oyster's self-protection against invasion, excretions of nacreous goo, hardly the stuff of poetry. Alas, cold hard facts win. The spiritual sense dies like shrimp in the oyster's briny maw, enveloped by the hard coating of science, and poetry with it. Sing, muse, of heaven's kingdom, but the pearl-strewn path is gone, swept away not so much by knowledge as by poetry's dependence on the oyster's truth. Homage to Tolkien, and I think also what he is trying to show us with the Silmarils. With Flieger has given us this idea to say, watch with Tolkien's, the literal in Tolkien's storytelling, for the metaphoric and the symbolic. And she would point in the Silmarils to this, the symbolism of light, which I think is definitely there, right? Because pearls also participate in that light. But I would add, through this understanding of them as pearl-like, in whatever, that Tolkien left it very open at this, that we don't know of what substance they were made, but in his earlier imaginings, they're water and glass and modeled on a pearl. They have that character of, and now when you go back to this, like the crystal of diamonds, it appears, but that crystal was to the Silmarils, but as the body to the children of Iluvatar, the house of its inner fire that is within it, and yet all parts of it, and is its life. Now, what I find hopeful in knowing that pearls are actually formed around living creatures is that they are participating in life, that pearls are truly alive on several different levels, and so that there is a hope for our further storytelling in rethinking our understanding of the pearls. But that Tolkien, well phrased and deeply learned in, well, the medieval storytelling. Remember his Pearl poem, which I won't make you read again right now. He also knew the older story, and I think maybe this indeterminacy that he gives to the substance of the Silmarils is another of his techniques for blending the medieval and the modern, the literal and the metaphoric, in ways that force us to both learn how to think in the medieval terms and, I don't know, it's like, to appreciate its loss, but because Tolkien gave us the stories that he did, to look again in hope for the heavenly. So what kind of gem were the Silmarils? A gem in which you would marry all of the elements of the earth with the heavenly dew. And now we can understand why the heart of Fëanor was fast bound to these things. But was that a good thing? To be continued. Thank you for joining me.